Hey everyone, Karnak here, Star Wars Armada Explained. Today I'm going to go more in depth about how ships maneuver, what is a ship's speed, what is temporary speed, how different cards and abilities affect speed and temporary speed. Because some people have come to me and asked several questions about how does, like, for example, the Rift work and G8 works with, like, take evasive action and engine techs and even though I've tried to explain it over the internet, just some stuff still gets lost in translation. So I'm going to be diving in specifically on some stuff that is very hard to grasp unless it is laid out step by step. And even I had a hard time grasping it when I first started playing if it hadn't been so thoroughly explained to me quite some time ago by Ian Cross, previous Worlds Judge, was patient enough to walk me through the steps. And even for me, it is still hard to explain well. So I'm going to do the best I can to explain these steps. So I'm explaining because particularly it's people who have questions about how does take evasive action work depending on what speed your ship is going and what is the ship speed, what is temporary speed, and this, that, and the other thing. So I have out RNG, I have out the FAQ, I've got out a bunch of cards and speed dials, and we're going to dive right in. Okay. So I have some examples and cards up that I'm going to be using here. And in this example specifically, we're going to be using, we've got a Rift out, an Interdictor with G8s, and a Gladiator with engine techs. And I have this face down fleet card representing take evasive action. And how does this all interlock and work? So in a nutshell, what is G8 does is that if a ship is at distance 1 to 5, when it goes to determine its course, you as that player controlling that card can say, hey, you need to reduce your speed by 1 temporarily. It's a temporary slowment. And what the Rift also does is if you are at distance 1 to 2 of the Rift, it has the same effect of G8s. It will slow that movement by 1. Okay, but how does that all interact with engine techs and, again, take evasive action? Okay, so I'm going to read a few things first because I can't just assume you guys know everything. I need to try to establish and then work up from there your understanding. So let's read a few things from RRG. So remember, when a ship is executing its maneuver for its activation, it needs to go by the speed which is being physically represented on its speed dial. So in a typical ship movement, you say, okay, I need to maneuver with my maneuver tool. How do I determine where I move on maneuver tool? I look at my ship's physical speed dial, the dial that you set your ship speed on. And in the example, we're going to say that the Gladiator is going speed 2. Okay, we're just going to talk about that ship's movement activation. So the first thing you do is you pull out the ship maneuver tool. Again, as it says there, you can change the yaw values depending on the ship speed chart for that current speed. So for the Gladiator, we're going to say it's going speed 2. It gets 1 click and 1 click on each joint, on the first and second joint that it can have. So when I lay down the maneuver tool, move this out of the way, it has the 1 click and again 1 click. Now, if you do have a navigation command or other abilities, it can affect how many clicks you get at those joints. The next step in the ship movement is that you then lock in the maneuver tool, so then the ship moves along the notches to the speed indicated on your ship's speed dial. Okay, so now that is essentially, in a nutshell, how movement is conducted. The ship, again, you notch it in, and it moves along where you want it to at speed 2. That is that ship's maneuver for that activation. Now, there are some cards and abilities in the game that can grant additional maneuvers beyond the ship's maneuver. One example of that is engine techs. Engine techs is if you have resolved the navigation command, whether you spent a dial or a token, or a dial and token together, you can execute a maneuver, or after you execute a maneuver, you may exhaust this card to execute a speed 1 maneuver. So why is this important? Why is it knowing that you're executing a maneuver at your ship's physical speed, and then engine text is telling you that you can execute a speed 1 maneuver? What difference does this all make? And once again, I need to read things out. So speed, this section here. A ship's speed determines how far it must move each activation. The ship's current speed is tracked on its speed dial. Again, speed dial, as we discussed. Skip the squadron part. So a ship's speed is consistent until the ship resolves a navigation command or uses an upgrade card effect to change speed. Minimum speed for all ships is 0. Each ship's maximum speed is indicated on its speed chart. If the ship does not have any yaw values in a speed column, it cannot accelerate to that speed. Speed chart. Each ship has a speed chart on its ship card, which indicates how far each joint can be clicked away from the center straight position. Each column on the chart corresponds to the specific speed, as indicated by a number at the bottom of that column. Each box in a column represents a joint on the maneuver tool, and the yaw value within that box indicates how many times the corresponding joint can be clicked in either direction, left or right. So again, when a ship is moving for that ship's activation, I know I've stated this already, but again, it's looking at the physical speed dial of the ship. Okay. So now let's get into where confusion is coming from. Again, this sounds like this all makes sense, but what happens, for example, if there's that interdictor nearby and he's got those G8s? So G8 says before an enemy ship at distance 1 to 5 resolves its determined course step, you may exhaust this card to temporarily reduce its speed by 1 to a minimum of 0 until the end of that maneuver. So if it was doing its normal ship activation, it is at the distance 1 to 5 of the interdictor. The player then exhausts G8s, or again, if he's at distance 1 to 2 of the rift, 1, 2. So even though your ship is moving at speed 2, and again, your ship's physical speed dial is 2, when it says it is temporarily reducing your speed, it's not physically changing your speed dial. That's not what it's doing. There are other cards and abilities that do that, but that is not what this card is doing. It is temporarily reducing your speed from 2 to 1, but it is not physically changing your ship's speed dial. It is still on 2. But you must make that maneuver as if you're going 1. So instead of, you make your plan maneuver as if you're going speed 2, he exhausted that card and says, just so you know, when you make that speed 2 maneuver, you need to go speed 1. So in which case then you can still use your speed 1 abilities. In which case, then he's no longer going 2. Even though, again, the physical dial has not changed, he moves 1. Okay. Now, what happens if we say that he has resolved his ability, resolved the navigation command? And just so you guys know, a navigation command, so for example, if this gladiator had been going speed 3 on his physical dial, if the G8s slowed him temporarily from 3 to 2, you cannot, for example, say, I'll use my navigation command to then increase my speed to go back up to 3. You can't do that. Why? Your physical dial is already set at 3. It can't, a gladiator cannot go speed 4. So you can't counteract or negate that temporary slow. There's another thing I want to read about G8 Experimental Projector, the card that's in the FAQ. When this effect is resolved on an enemy ship and that ship changes its speed dial during the determined course step, the ship's speed is temporarily reduced by 1 from the current speed on its dial. So again, to follow up what I was just saying, It's changing the speed dial, but it's temporary, it's not permanent. Also, this effect can be resolved on an enemy ship that's executing a maneuver from an effect such as engine text or quantum storm, or if you're playing Rift Ambush, the special rule Rift Ambush maneuver. This effect is resolved before the determined course step of that maneuver and reduces the ship's temporary speed by 1 to a minimum of 0. So what does it mean, temporary speed, in all this? So again, I hope you guys are still following along. There's an FAQ as well about this. I'm going to read that now. When an effect instructs a ship to execute a maneuver outside of its usual execute maneuver step, what is that ship's speed? While executing that additional maneuver, that ship's speed is temporarily set to the speed indicated by the effect that is resolved. The ship executes that maneuver by completing the determined course and move steps. That ship's current speed is still tracked by its speed dial, and the ship does not count as having changed its speed. Why is it saying this? So for engine techs, when you're exhausting engine techs, for example, if this gladiator is going speed 3, you are not suddenly dropping your speed dial to speed 1 to execute this maneuver. You're still going speed 3 on your physical ship dial. What engine techs is giving you instead is a temporary speed. And this temporary speed is set to speed 1. And it's allowing you to execute a speed 1 maneuver that is outside of that ship's usual execution of maneuver. Because in this example, you've already moved, let's say, the gladiator at speed 3. You've executed its typical maneuver based on its physical dial. When you exhaust engine techs, that card is giving you an extra special movement. And in order to grant that movement, it has to tell you the speed at which that is conducted. So that is why it is saying it is a speed 1 maneuver. It is essentially giving you a temporary speed dial. Now this temporary speed dial can still be affected by G8s and the Rift to temporarily slow that speed 1 maneuver to 0. Okay, so those aren't no longer, because if they were affecting your physical ship dial during that extra movement, it wouldn't do anything to stop engine techs. But that's not the case, because as those effects are written, it is slowing that determined course step of that maneuver. Whether that maneuver being that ship's physical initial movement on its physical dial, or the temporary movement being granted by the other card effect. I hope this is making sense, and again, it's kind of building up to where I'm leading to. So again, this is why G8s and the Rift can slow the engine tech maneuver or similar effects from 1 to 0, and it is not affecting the physical dial unless it is that ship's actual movement based off of its physical speed dial. Now this is where we get into the tricky part about how does this work with take evasive action. And this, I was trying to lay the foundation to lead up to this. So take evasive action reads, for its ability, each friendly ship may increase the last yaw value of its current speed by 1 during its determined course step. So if you were to read this card, you are likely to make the assumption, oh, I get a yaw on my last yaw value at my last speed that I'm going at for any movement that I make. Easy peasy, right? So in a nutshell, how does this ability work? So again, I place down that maneuver tool. Take evasive action is giving me additional yaw at my last speed only. So for this gladiator, it gets no yaw on 1 and then 1 and 1. So instead of being able to only just make the 1 yaw, it can make the 2 yaw T makes it that. Or again, if it's going speed 2, instead of just the 1 yaw, it's 2 yaw. All right. That's what take evasive action does. But again, to read intricately into its card, it says you may increase the last yaw value of its current speed by 1. When it's saying it's referring to that ship. And when it says current speed, it is referring to that ship's current speed set on its physical dial. Meaning that when the ship is slowed by an effect like G8 or gravity rift, when it is temporarily reducing its speed from 3 to 2, the ship's physical dial is not changed. Its current speed is technically 3. Meaning that when you go to move speed 2, you don't get that extra yaw click on 2. Because that is not the ship's current speed. Or for that movement, it is that ship's current speed because it is being temporarily released by 2. So sorry, I stumbled a little bit because I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So to back up a bit, when its physical dial is temporarily reduced from 3 to 2, it does get take evasive action even still on that temporary movement. Okay, but now let's go back to a movement granted by engine techs. So remember, this is executing a speed 1 maneuver. It is telling you the speed at which this maneuver is executed. If your ship's physical speed dial is set to 3, that's its current speed for that ship. The temporary movement is giving you a temporary speed 1 movement. But guess what? That is not that ship's current speed. It is a speed of which a maneuver you've been giving is being executed at. But again, that's not its current speed on its physical dial. Meaning, take evasive action does not work with speed 1 maneuvers unless also that ship's physical speed dial is also set to speed 1. That's where I'm trying to build and get and lead up to. So, ship's physical speed, temporary speed granted by an ability. Again, ship temporary speed granted by an ability, not the ship's physical speed. Not the same thing. It is different and separate as it explained in the FAQ. Because they're each conducting their own separate movement steps. So I hope that that is sufficient enough of an explanation. So now I'm going to go through a real world example real fast. Okay. So I have this gladiator. He is currently at speed 2, or excuse me, speed 3 on his physical dial. I go to lay down my maneuver tool and say I'm getting ready to conduct my maneuver at speed 3. My opponent with G8 says, hey, you're at distance 1 to 5. I'm going to exhaust. This would work. There we go. I'm going to exhaust G8s. So just so you know, that speed is temporarily reduced by 1. So take evasive action is still working with that because the temporary reduction is still technically that ship's current speed for that maneuver. So I still can get the benefit of yaw click on 2. So I go 1 and 2. Perfect. Let's say I also made sure I was using a navigation command for this effect. So now again, that temporary speed where it was reduced from 2 goes back to the speed I have set on my physical ship dial, which is set at speed 3. I say, I want to resolve engine text now. I'm going to exhaust that card. This card is now giving me a temporary speed 1 maneuver. It is its own, essentially just think of it as its own separate speed dial it is handing to you to conduct this maneuver. I say, great, I'm going to make that maneuver now. But guess what? I am now at distance 1 to 2. There we go. I'm now at distance 1 to 2 of this gravity rift. This gravity rift is now slowing this temporary maneuver by 1, which changes it from 1 to 0 for that temporary movement. Because that is what it's targeting. This is what's allowing me to be granted to move along the maneuver tool. It's this, the temporary speed given to me, not the physical dial I have currently on my ship. Okay? Now, if the rift wasn't there, and I was granted this temporary speed 1 movement, let's look again at take evasive action. It says, increase the last yaw value of its current speed by 1 during its current course step. So again, when it's saying its current speed, as we've established, its current speed is what is physically on the ship's dial, not the temporary movement being granted by the engine tax. Because again, engine tax is not physically changing that ship's speed to 1. It's still at 3. It's granting a bonus movement at speed 1. T does not work with the engine tech maneuver unless my physical dial speed is also set to 1. So that is, hopefully I explained that well enough. And that should, pretty much that all still coincides with also how these special movements and things work in Rift Ambush as well. And also the other effects and abilities that the Rift has. But of course, if you have questions, if you feel like the explanation still isn't clear or in order enough, please let me know. I tried to make sure I was going through step by step. I understand it's difficult, but that is essentially just order of sequence and order of operations as laid out in RRNG and the FAQ. And again, going based on card wordings for all of this. But if you feel like I messed something up or didn't make something clear, point it out, let me know, and I'll try to explain it in more detail in the comments. You guys are great. I hope this video has been helpful, and I'll catch you all next time.